Imagine winds so powerful they could tear your roof clean off, storms that hurl rain horizontally with the force of bullets. Picture a coastline so harsh and unforgiving that modern buildings would crumble within seasons. This was the reality for Scottish Highland crofters in the 18th and 19th centuries. Following the brutal Highland clearances between 1750 and 1860, thousands of families were forcibly relocated to the harshest edges of Scotland, barren coastlines with poor soil and murderous weather. Armed with nothing but ancient knowledge, raw materials from the land, and sheer determination, these displaced Scots developed one of history's most ingenious survival dwellings. Here's what daily life was actually like inside a black house, where surviving meant working with nature's fury rather than against it. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them thinking, wait, people in New Zealand listen to history stories to sleep? Okay, tonight it's 18th century Scottish black houses. But hold on. Get comfortable first. Fluff those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Where we're going, you'll want to be cozy, because the word cozy didn't exactly apply where we're headed. Your eyes snap open. The first thing that registers isn't the darkness. You're used to that. It's the sound, that howling, screaming wind. It's found a new gap somewhere in the thatch, creating a high-pitched whistle that cuts through the low, constant roar outside. The stones tied to the ends of the roof ropes thud rhythmically against the outer wall, a reminder that at any moment the very shelter above your head could be torn away. You're lying on a bed that's nothing like the cloud-soft mattress cradling your body right now. It's a simple wooden frame stuffed with straw, covered with a rough woolen blanket woven by your mother and sisters. The straw crackles as you shift, trying to find a position where the knots and lumps don't dig into your back. The wool is scratchy against your skin, but warm. That's what matters. Get up, lad, your father's voice cuts through the darkness. Fire needs tending. You know what's at stake. In this black house, on this cruel stretch of Scottish coastline, letting the fire die isn't just an inconvenience, it's potentially a death sentence. And you smell it now, that rich, earthy scent of peat smoke that fills the upper half of your home. The smoke isn't a problem, it's a feature. In your family's black house, smoke means life. Wait, hold up, you might be thinking. What exactly is a black house? Fair question. These weren't just houses, they were survival machines, perfected over generations of trial and error on some of the most unforgiving land in Europe. The name Black House is actually a bit of a historical accident. See, they weren't called that until the early 1900s, when newer white houses with chimneys and separate animal quarters started appearing. Before that, they were just houses, the only kind most Highland and Island Scots had ever known. Imagine walking out into that fierce Scottish dawn with your father. The wind is trying its best to knock you flat. The rain feels like needles against your face, and the grey light barely penetrates the low clouds. You're wearing wool clothing that's been waterproofed with lanolin, sheep's oil. But even so, you'll be damp all day. That's just life here. Your home doesn't stand tall against the horizon. That would be suicide in these winds. Instead, it hugs the earth, built into a slight depression in the landscape, its back to the prevailing wind. From a distance, it looks like nothing more than a small grassy mound. You're probably thinking, why not just move somewhere less hellish? I laugh. Good question, except they tried that. It wasn't their choice. This is where the story gets dark. Between 1750 and 1860, during what became known as the Highland Clearances, over 100,000 Scottish Highlanders were forcibly evicted from their fertile inland valleys. Landowners had realised they could make more money with sheep than with people. So entire communities were uprooted, sometimes violently, and pushed to the coastal margins where the soil was thin and rocky, to the edge of existence. "Here's your land now," the landowners essentially said, pointing to places like this, windswept, storm-battered coastlines where growing enough food to survive would be a daily battle. Many Scots emigrated to America, Canada, and elsewhere. Others tried to make it work here. And the wild thing? They did make it work, through a blend of engineering genius and sheer stubbornness. The Black House was their solution, a design refined over centuries to handle the specific challenges of surviving in a place where the weather actively wants you dead. Your father points to a spot near the coastal ridge where a neighbour is considering building. "Wrong place," he mutters. "He'll lose his roof in the first winter storm." Site selection was critical. A Black House builder might spend weeks studying the land, watching how the wind moved across the terrain, where water pooled after rain, where snow drifted in winter. They looked for natural windbreaks, rocky outcrops, folds in the hillside, anything that would deflect the worst of the Atlantic's fury. "The best spot isn't always the most obvious," your father explains, as you both kneel to examine the soil and rocks in this potential building site. "You want to be in a slight hollow, but not somewhere that'll flood. You need to be sheltered, but not so sheltered you can't see danger coming." They were built into slopes when possible, their backs to the prevailing wind, profiles kept so low that from a distance they looked like nothing more than natural mounds. This wasn't just aesthetics, it was survival. A house that stood tall would be torn apart by the first major storm. In your head you're thinking, "This is how I die, by wind." But out loud, you're learning, because one day you'll need to build your own Black House. The morning chores are relentless. The animals in the byre, the part of the Black House where livestock lived, need tending. The single cow that represents your family's most valuable possession needs milking. The sheep need checking. The peat fire needs feeding. And that's all before breakfast. You slip into the byre end of the Black House, separated from the living quarters by just a simple wooden partition. The smell hits you first, that rich, pungent mix of animal bodies, manure, and hay. Your modern nose might recoil, but to you it's the smell of wealth, of survival. The gentle lowing of the cow, the soft bleating of the sheep. These are comforting sounds. These animals aren't just livestock. They're family members. Their body heat helps warm the house in winter. Without them, you'd likely freeze to death. The cow's not just a walking milk factory, I tell you. She's basically a living, breathing space heater. One cow produces about 1,500 BTUs of heat per hour, roughly equivalent to a small modern heater running non-stop. You milk her with practiced hands, careful not to waste a drop. The milk will become butter, cheese, and whey, all vital foods for surviving the lean months. Nothing goes to waste here. Even the cow's manure has a purpose, channeled through a stone drain to the outside midden, waste pile, where it'll be composted and used as fertilizer for the precious crops. Back inside the living quarters, your mother and sisters are already up. The central hearth, just a fire burning on a flat stone in the middle of the room, gives off a gentle, steady heat. There's no chimney. The smoke rises to the rafters, then slowly filters out through the thatch. This isn't poor design. It's deliberate. The smoke preserves the thatch, kills insects, and cures the meat and fish hanging from the rafters. So wait, you might ask, how did they not suffocate with all that smoke? They adapted. People learned to live below the smoke layer, which typically hung about 4 to 5 feet above the floor. The temperature difference between the upper and lower parts of the room created a natural convection current that circulated air and drew fresh oxygen through small gaps around doors and walls. Kids literally grew up learning to stay low, to work and play beneath the smoke line. Your family gathers around the hearth for a simple breakfast. Oatmeal porridge made with milk, maybe some preserved fish if times aren't too hard. The fire has likely been burning continuously for years, maybe decades. When a new house was built, tradition held that an ember from the old hearth would be used to start the new fire, connecting generations. After breakfast, you join your father and neighbours to continue work on a new black house being built for a young couple in the community. This isn't a job for one family, it's a communal effort. Everyone helps because next time it might be your house that needs rebuilding after a particularly vicious storm. The foundation is already laid, a simple rectangular trench filled with stones. Now comes the walls, and these walls are something special. Or modern builders would have a nervous breakdown looking at these, I tell you. No mortar, no concrete, no power tools, just stones, earth, and knowledge passed down through generations. The walls of a black house weren't single walls, but 2 concentric rings of dry stone built about 1 meter apart. The outer wall used the largest, most weathered stones, the soldiers, your father calls them, the first line of defense against the storm. The inner wall used smaller, more regular stones, creating a smooth interior surface. The gap between would be packed with dense peat earth, creating a core of insulation 1 meter thick. You watch as an older man, a master builder, selects each stone with a practiced eye, fitting them together in a complex, interlocking puzzle. There's no mortar, only the friction and weight of the stones hold the wall together. Your job is to help find and carry suitable stones from the nearby fields and shore. It's back-breaking work, but necessary. This technique, your father explains as he demonstrates how to place a particularly awkward stone, is called dry stain diking. My father taught me as his father taught him. The master builder has an almost mystical relationship with the stones. He can look at a pile of rocks and somehow see the wall within them, each stone finding its perfect place in the structure. The precision is remarkable. Even centuries later, you wouldn't be able to slide a knife blade between properly placed stones in these ancient walls. The earth used for the core isn't just any soil, it's carefully selected peat rich in organic matter that will compact over time into a dense insulating mass. Sometimes they mix in small stones, animal hair, or straw for binding. This mixture, when properly compacted, creates an insulation system with an R value comparable to modern materials, but with the added benefit of thermal mass that stores and releases heat over many hours. Women bring food to the workers. Simple bread, perhaps some fish or mutton if available. They cook over an open fire built within the partially completed structure, the smoke mingling with the mist that rolls in from the sea. Children run about, helping where they can, learning through observation and occasional instruction. The youngest ones gather smaller stones, their hands reddened by the cold and the rough work. This wasn't just construction, I explain. It was a ritual, a communal act of will against the encroaching wilderness. It was how communities survived. By mid-afternoon, the walls have grown higher. They're typically 3 to 4 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rise. This massive construction could withstand wind loads that would destroy modern frame construction, and it was built entirely by hand. As you work, an older man tells stories of the inland valleys where your grandparents lived before the clearances, greener, more fertile land, more sheltered from the worst of the Atlantic gales. There's anger in his voice, but also resignation. This harsh coast is home now. The work continues until the failing light makes it too dangerous. Stonework requires good vision. A misplaced stone could mean a collapsed wall, wasted effort, or even injury. You return home, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. Inside your family's black house, the evening routine begins. The fire is stoked with carefully dried peat. Smoke fills the upper reaches of the room, and in its hazy light you can see sides of fish and haunches of mutton hanging from the rafters, slowly curing in the smoke. Your mother prepares a simple dinner, perhaps a broth made with whatever vegetables they've managed to grow in the poor soil, enhanced with a small amount of precious meat or fish. After dinner, the family gathers around the hearth. This is the time for stories, for songs, for the passing down of knowledge. Your grandmother tells tales of the old days, of clan battles and fairy folk. Your mother spins wool while your father mends tools. Children listen with wide eyes, absorbing the oral history of their people. This was their television, their internet, I tell you, their connection to the wider world and their past. The fire casts dancing shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the wind continues to howl, but in here, in this low, dark, smoke-filled space, there's warmth, there's family, there's survival. As night deepens, you retreat to your straw bed. The fire will burn low but never out. Someone will tend it through the night, making sure the precious flame continues. The sounds of the house settle around you, the soft breathing of your siblings, the occasional bleating from the byre, the eternal conversation between wind and stone outside. The black house doesn't fight the storm. It yields to it, becomes part of it. Like the people who built it, it endures. Unlike your comfortable bed right now, with its soft pillows and warm blankets, sleep comes to you on a bed of straw, under rough wool, in a hazy world of peat smoke and stone. Yet, despite the hardships, there's a rhythm to this life, a certainty in the daily struggle that has its own kind of peace. And so ends your first day in the world of the Scottish Black House. But the story of how these remarkable structures were built to survive the Atlantic's fury is just beginning. The walls are up, but what happens when the real enemy comes from above? When tons of water and wind try to rip away the very shelter over your head? The roof of a black house was not just a covering, it was a living shield against the sky. And that's where we'll go next. Dawn breaks with reluctance over the Scottish coast, as if the sun itself is hesitant to face the Atlantic's fury. You've already been awake for an hour, the scratchy wool of your blanket now replaced by the rougher fabric of your work clothes. Your father stands at the doorway, gauging the weather like others might read a newspaper. Good day for roof work, he declares, which means simply it's not actively trying to kill us right now. Yesterday, we left off with the walls of our black house rising stone by stone. Today, we face an even greater challenge, creating a roof that won't surrender to the first serious gale. Your breakfast is simple, oatcakes and a bit of milk from your cow. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going. The peat fire smoulders in the centre of the room, smoke rising lazily to escape through the thatch above. Your grandfather sits nearby, his gnarled hands working a piece of driftwood into a tool handle. You ever wonder why our houses don't have chimneys? Your grandfather asks, noticing your gaze following the smoke. Tried that once. Wind tore it clean off, nearly took the whole roof with it. Here's the thing about living on the edge of Scotland. You don't fight nature. You adapt to it. Or you die. Simple as that. The whole community gathers at the half-built black house. Today is roof day, and it takes many hands. Men, women, children, everyone has a role to play. Your job will be to help gather heather and straw for the thatch. Okay, so picture this, I say. You're not just building a roof, you're creating what's basically a heavy, flexible blanket designed to hug the building and deflect the wind. Before anything else, you need timber for the frame, and that's a problem because the Highlands and Islands of Scotland aren't exactly known for their abundant forests. Centuries of deforestation for agriculture, shipbuilding, and iron smelting left these landscapes largely treeless. So, where do you get wood? Watch for it, an older boy tells you, pointing to the shore. After storms, the sea gives gifts. Driftwood. In this treeless landscape, wood washed up on shore after storms was more valuable than gold. Families would walk miles along the coast collecting these weather-beaten treasures. Every piece was gathered, evaluated, and stored with almost religious reverence. "That piece there," your father says, pointing to a massive timber half buried in sand. "That's a roof beam if I ever saw one." It takes 4 men to drag it from the beach. It might have been part of a ship once, or perhaps a tree uprooted somewhere far away. Now it will become the central ridge beam of a black house. The larger pieces of driftwood would become main rafters, while smaller branches and twigs would be woven together to create a lattice for the thatch. These timbers, already seasoned by salt and sun, were naturally resistant to rot, perfect for the damp conditions of a black house roof. "All right," your father directs, "get that heather up to the house site. Mind you pick the longest stems. You and other children fan out across the hillsides, harvesting heather, rushes, and straw. Your hands are scratched and raw by midday, but your pile grows steadily. The women sort through what you bring, selecting the best pieces for different parts of the roof. Back at the building site, you watch in fascination as the first timbers go up. But something seems odd. The rafters don't rest on the outer wall as you might expect. Instead, they sit on the inner wall. Why not use both walls? You ask your father. He grins. "Sharp eye, lad. Watch and learn." This design creates a distinctive shelf, or scarcement, around the outside of the house, typically 18 to 24 inches wide. At first glance, it seems like a mistake, but like everything in the Black House, it serves multiple critical purposes. The shelf does 3 things, an elder explains. First, it lets the rain run down the thatch and soak the top of the earthen wall, keeping it damp and adding weight. Second, it gives us a place to walk around the house for repairs. And third, it protects the lower walls from the worst of the driving rain. You're baffled. You want the walls to stay wet? The men laugh. Aye, your father says. Dry walls crack and shift. Wet walls stay put. A house designed to be wet on the outside, a feature that would horrify a modern builder but was essential to the Black House's survival. The constant moisture kept the earthen core from drying out and cracking, adding stability to the entire structure. Hold up, I interrupt. Let me explain what's happening here because it's actually genius. They created a self-stabilizing system. The heavier the rain, the more weight added to the walls. The worse the weather, the stronger the house became. Once the timber frame is secured, the real artistry begins. The thatch isn't just thrown on haphazardly. It's a thick mattress of local materials, heather, rushes, cereal straw, laid in dense, carefully arranged layers. The women work alongside the men, their fingers flying as they bundle and bind the materials. Children shuttle back and forth, bringing supplies, fresh water, and occasionally food. This is no individual effort. It's the community coming together to ensure survival. The thatching process is an art form requiring skill and experience to create a waterproof covering that would last for decades. The thatch is laid in overlapping layers like scales on a fish, each layer shedding water to the one below. The thickness varies, 12 inches at the ridge to 18 inches at the eaves, creating a natural drainage system channeling water away from the structure. But hold on, you might ask. How do you keep a thatch roof from being torn away by those 100 mph gusts you mentioned? Great question. This is where true ingenuity comes in. As you watch your father and others create a web of ropes woven from twisted heather stems or straw. These aren't modern ropes. They're materials literally twisted together by hand into surprisingly strong cords. The men weave these in a diamond pattern across the entire roof. "Hand me those," your father says, pointing to a pile of stones that children have laboriously gathered from the fields and shore. And here's the brilliant part. At the end of each rope, a heavy stone is tied. This weighted net, this stone-studded veil, will hold the thatch down against the fiercest storms. Good roof stones are family treasures, your grandfather tells you, showing you a particularly well-shaped specimen. "My father used this one, his father before him. God willing, your children will use it too." The stones aren't random rocks. They're carefully chosen weights, often shaped by generations of use. Some families have stones that have been used for decades, passed down from father to son like precious heirlooms. "So the stones swing in the wind?" you ask, trying to picture it. "Exactly," your grandfather nods. "Their movement absorbs the energy of the gusts and prevents the roof from lifting. When a storm comes, you'll hear them thudding against the wall. That's how you know your roof's still there." By mid-afternoon, the basic thatch is in place, but the work isn't finished. Now comes the turf layer. Sections of sod cut from the surrounding land are laid on top of the thatch, adding further insulation and weight. In summer, your mother tells you, pointing to the newly laid turf, that'll sprout a carpet of flowers. By next year, you'll hardly tell there's a house here from a distance. The roof isn't just a covering, it's a living thing that changes and adapts with the seasons. In summer, it becomes a meadow of wildflowers. In winter, it's covered with snow, adding even more insulation and weight. The black house is designed to carry this load. The thick walls easily supporting the additional tons of snow and ice. "Folk who travel here from the south," your father says, "they laugh at our houses, call them primitive, but their fancy homes would be kindling in the first winter storm." You help secure the last of the stones as the day winds down. Standing back, you can see how the black house now truly looks, like a part of the landscape, not separate from it. From certain angles, it's hard to tell where the hillside ends and the house begins. This evening, your family joins the others to celebrate the completion of the roof. There might be music, a fiddle or pipes if your community is fortunate enough to have them. There will definitely be stories passed down through generations, tales of the old homeland before the clearances forced your people to these marginal lands. The night grows dark, but inside, the black house is warm with bodies and peat smoke. An older man, respected for his wisdom, raises a cup of precious whiskey. "To the house," he says. "May it stand firm against the storm." Everyone drinks. Then he adds more quietly, "And to the day we return to the glens that are rightfully ours." Some nod. Others look away. The wounds of displacement are still fresh for many. As the night wears on, you find yourself sitting beside the master builder, the man who seemed to speak to the stones themselves as he worked. "How did you learn to build like that?" you ask him. He's silent for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the central hearth. "Wasn't something learned from books," he finally says. "My father would stand behind me, his hands on mine, showing me how to feel the stone, not just see it, how to find its balance point, its natural place in the wall." "Could anyone learn?" you ask. He studies you with a craftsman's eye. "Some take to it, some don't. The stones speak, but not everyone listens." You're still pondering this when your father calls that it's time to head home. The celebration will continue, but children need their sleep. Tomorrow brings more work. It always does. Walking home through the darkness, the wind tugging at your clothes, you look up at a brief break in the clouds. Stars shine with fierce brightness, illuminating the landscape in silver. The half-built black house is just a darker shadow against the hillside, already becoming part of the land. Why do they call them black houses? You ask your father, realizing you've never questioned the name before. He chuckles. They didn't always. Used to just be houses. Then some fancy folk from the south built white houses with lime mortar and chimneys. Ours became black by comparison. Dark stone, dark smoke. Inside your own black house, the familiar smells envelop you. Peat smoke, wool, the earthy scent of the animals in the byre. Your mother has kept the fire going, and the interior is warm despite the chill night outside. Tonight, as you settle onto your straw bed, you find yourself listening for the sound of stones thumping against the walls. Your grandfather once told you that you could judge the strength of a storm by the rhythm of the roof stones. A gentle tattoo meant nothing to worry about. A frantic drumming meant prayers were in order. Tonight is peaceful, just the occasional soft thud as a gust catches one of the hanging weights, but you know that won't always be the case. Winter's coming, your grandfather had said earlier, looking out at the darkening sky. This one feels like it'll have teeth. I pause in my storytelling. This is where I should mention that these people weren't just surviving, they were living with a kind of elegant efficiency we've largely forgotten. Their black house maintained stable temperatures within 5 to 10 degrees throughout the day. Modern homes fluctuate 15 to 20 degrees without constant energy input. The last thought before sleep takes you is about the roof stones. Your grandfather showed you one that had been in the family for 3 generations. Somehow that simple rock had outlasted the people who first used it, had weathered countless storms and remained. There's comfort in that permanence, that continuity. As you drift into sleep in your black house, the wind picks up outside. The stones begin their gentle drumming against the walls, but you're not afraid. The house was built to work with the storm, not against it. The harder the wind blows, the more firmly the stones hold down the thatch. While you lie in your comfortable modern bed, cushioned by technology and insulated from the elements, imagine falling asleep to that rhythm, the conversation between wind and stone that has continued for centuries on the Scottish coast, a lullaby of survival. But what about inside the black house? With no chimney, how did families survive the smoke? And what about the livestock? How did humans and animals coexist under one roof? That's where our story continues, with the hearth, the true heart of the black house. The morning arrives with a strange quiet. The wind that's been howling for days has finally paused to catch its breath. In the eerie silence, you can hear something you rarely notice. The soft patter of rain on thatch, not driven sideways for once, just falling straight down. A luxury. But the real alarm clock is your lungs. Something's different about the air. Thicker, more acrid. Fire needs tending, your mother's voice cuts through the smoky haze hanging lower than usual in the black house. Without the wind pulling it through the thatch, the peat smoke has settled, creating a dense layer that hovers about 4 feet from the floor. You roll from your straw bed, staying low where the air is clearer, and crawl toward the central hearth. This is the heart of your home, the soul of the black house, and right now it's struggling. So this is what happens when we get a nice day, I tell you. When there's no wind, the smoke has nowhere to go. Welcome to the paradox of black house life. The calm days could suffocate you. The fire sits on a large flat stone in the exact centre of the house. There's no chimney, no fireplace as you might recognise, just flames dancing directly on stone, with smaller stones creating a ring to contain them. This hearth is positioned precisely equidistant from all walls to ensure even heat distribution. You poke at the embers with an iron rod, one of the few metal tools your family owns. The fire responds with a belch of smoke and a cascade of glowing orange specks. Your eyes sting, but you resist the urge to stand up. Up there, in the thick smoke, you'd be coughing in seconds. Low and slow, your grandfather always says. That's how we survive. This morning, your father and the older boys are already gone. Today is peat cutting day, one of the most important tasks of the year. Without peat, there is no fire. Without fire, there is no life. Simple as that. Can I go help? You ask your mother as she kneels beside you, adding small pieces of dried peat to coax the fire back to full strength. She eyes you critically. You're old enough this year, but eat first. Breakfast is oatmeal porridge again, made with precious milk and a tiny scraping of honey from the hive your uncle keeps. You eat quickly, eager to join the men at the peat bog. Okay, picture this, I say. Peat isn't like the firewood most people think of. It's not logs from trees. It's literally the land itself, layers upon layers of partially decomposed vegetation that's been compressed over thousands of years into a dense, burnable material. The path to the community peat bog winds through rocky fields. You pass neighbours also heading that way, carrying specialised tools, the Tarasgare, peat iron and the Sleen peat spade, tools designed specifically for this crucial task. Some families have had their peat cutting tools for generations, handles worn smooth by the hands of ancestors. When you reach the bog, it's already a hive of activity. Men stand in muddy trenches, cutting rectangular blocks from the black earth with practiced precision. Every family has their allocated spot, a tradition honoured for generations. Your father sees you and waves you over, his face already streaked with dirt and sweat despite the cool morning. Watch first, he instructs, positioning you where you can observe his technique. The work is methodical. The top layer of living vegetation is carefully cut away and set aside. Then the dark, fibrous peat below is cut into brick-sized blocks. Each block must be the right size. Too large and it won't dry properly. Too small and the effort isn't worth the fuel gained. Your grandfather could cut 100 blocks an hour, your father tells you, pride and challenge mixing in his voice. Best in the township. How many can you cut? You ask. He grins. 80 on a good day, but I'm still young. The first block he hands you is surprisingly heavy and wet. It's not something you could burn, not yet. It needs months of drying before it becomes fuel. The ancient Egyptians had their pyramids, I interject. The Scottish crofters had their peat stacks. Monuments to survival rather than death, and just as precisely constructed. By midday, the field is dotted with thousands of fresh-cut peat blocks laid out in careful formations designed to maximize air circulation. They'll stay here for weeks, gradually drying before being stacked into distinctive conical piles for further drying. Finally, months later, they'll be brought home and stored in the peat stack beside the black house, fuel for the coming year. Your arms ache from carrying the wet blocks, but there's satisfaction in the work. This is life. This is survival. This is connection to the very land beneath your feet. On the walk home, you notice women and younger children gathering along the shore. They're collecting seaweed, another essential resource. Some will be used as fertilizer for the meager crops. Some will be dried and burned to produce kelp, which can be sold for cash, a rare commodity in your subsistence lifestyle. Everybody works, your father says, following your gaze, even the wee ones. That's how we survive here. Back at the Black House, your mother has kept the fire burning all day, as she does every day. The fire is never allowed to go out. Never. To lose the fire means to start again with flint and steel. Difficult, time-consuming work that wastes precious energy. Some families claim their hearth fire has been burning continuously for decades, embers carefully preserved even when moving to a new home. When your cousin's family built their Black House last year, your grandmother ceremoniously carried an ember from your hearth to theirs, ensuring the continuity of flame from one generation to the next. The interior of your home looks different in afternoon light. Thin beams of sunshine penetrate through small gaps in the thatch, creating shafts of illumination in the smoky air. The light catches dust motes and smoke particles, making them dance like tiny stars in a hazy galaxy. Wait, so they lived their entire lives basically hotboxing themselves? I laugh. Yeah. But it wasn't a design flaw. The smoke was essential to their survival. It was a feature, not a bug. The layer of black, greasy soot coating the rafters testifies to years of peat burning. This coating serves crucial purposes. It preserves the timber, preventing rot and insect damage. More importantly, it creates a naturally antiseptic environment where meat and fish can be safely preserved. You glance up at the rafters where today's precious catch, 3 good-sized fish your brother brought from the coast, are already hanging in the smoke. They'll remain there for days, gradually transforming from perishable food to long-lasting protein that will sustain the family through lean times. How long until they're ready? You ask your mother, eyeing the fish hopefully. Patience, she replies, not looking up from the wool she's carding. Good smoke curing can't be rushed. Near the fire, your youngest sister plays with a rough doll made from scraps of cloth. She stays low to the ground, already trained to avoid the smoke layer above. Children in Black Houses learn early to live in this strange, stratified world, the upper smoke-filled zone and the lower, breathable area where daily life unfolds. The smoke layer was typically 4 to 5 feet above the floor, I explain, creating a clear zone where the family could live and work. The temperature difference between the upper and lower parts created a natural convection current that helped circulate air and draw fresh oxygen in through small gaps. A primitive but effective ventilation system. Your mother notices you watching your sister. Take her outside for a bit, she suggests. It's good to get fresh air when the weather allows. Outside, the world seems impossibly bright after the dim interior. Your sister blinks and squints beside you. The humble Black House may seem dark and smoky to modern sensibilities, but to you, it's simply home, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of coastal life. Several neighbours are out, taking advantage of the rare calm to make repairs or just breathe air that isn't confined by stone walls. An elderly woman sits on a stone by her door, face turned to the weak sunshine, fingers automatically spinning wool even as her eyes close in momentary contentment. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she calls to you as you pass. "Storm's coming tomorrow. I feel it in my bones." You nod respectfully. Old Margaret's weather predictions are rarely wrong, more accurate than any barometer, people say. Her bones have been recording atmospheric pressure changes on this coast for over 80 years. Folk wisdom wasn't just superstition, I point out. It was data collection across generations. When Margaret said a storm was coming, smart people battened down the hatches. By evening, the community begins to gather. Not everyone, not formally, but a gradual congregation of neighbours stopping by bringing small offerings. A handful of mussels, a bit of dried seaweed, herbs gathered from sheltered spots. The Black House becomes a social hub as people filter in, seeking warmth, companionship and the timeless comfort of shared stories. In modern terms, this is the prime time entertainment slot. No TV, no smartphones, just human connection in its purest form. The central hearth provides not just physical warmth, but serves as the social nucleus of community life. The Black House grows crowded as night falls, bodies pressed together on simple benches and stools around the hearth. The air thickens with smoke and breath and the earthy smell of wool and bodies. To modern noses it would be overwhelming. To you it's the scent of community, of belonging. Your grandfather, respected for his memory and gift with words, begins a story as firelight flickers across his weathered face. His voice drops to just above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in, creating an intimate circle of shared experience. The Mackenzie clan once held the valley south of here, he begins, and immediately children and adults alike fall silent. Their cattle were fat, their fields were green, their children grew strong. You've heard versions of this story before. They all end the same way, with displacement, with loss, with the clearances that drove your people to this marginal coastline. But the telling matters, the remembering matters. The laird came with men from the south, your grandfather continues, his voice hardening. They said the land would serve better growing wool than growing children. They gave 1 day to pack, 1 day to leave homes that had sheltered 5 generations. Around the fire, heads nod. Some of the older folk lived through these evictions themselves. Others, like you, know them only as stories, but stories that explain why you live here, in this harsh place, instead of the fertile valleys inland. Wait, so they'd just tell entire communities to get out? I interject. Yeah, exactly that brutal. Imagine coming home to find an eviction notice giving you 24 hours to leave the land your family had farmed for centuries, all because sheep were more profitable than people. As the night deepens, stories shift from historical to mythical. Tales of selkies, seal people who could shed their skins and walk as humans, of the blue men of the Minch who would challenge sailors to verse competitions, of fairy folk who might steal a child or bless a house, depending on their whim. These stories serve practical purposes beyond entertainment. They encode warnings, stay away from certain dangerous coastal areas where the blue men dwell, reinforce community values, always show hospitality even to strangers who might be more than they appear, and maintain cultural identity in the face of displacement and hardship. The fire burns low. Children, including your younger siblings, have fallen asleep where they sit, heads nodding onto parents' shoulders or directly onto the packed earth floor. The adults' conversations turn to practical matters: tomorrow's weather, the condition of the fishing boats, whether the barley planted in the poor soil might actually yield a crop this year. Gradually, neighbours begin to leave, returning to their own black houses through the darkness. The warm, smoky, communal space empties until only your family remains. Your father banks the fire carefully, dampening it so it will burn slowly through the night, but never go out. "To bed," your mother says simply. But before you can settle onto your straw mattress, your father calls you to the door. Outside, the sky has cleared, stars blaze overhead with an intensity rarely seen in our modern light-polluted world. "Look," he says, pointing to a subtle shift in the star patterns. "Winds changing. Storm coming. Like Margaret said, tomorrow we secure everything." You nod, absorbing another lesson in reading the world around you. In this place, such knowledge isn't academic, it's survival. Back inside, the black house has settled into night rhythms. The smoke hangs lower as the fire burns down. The animals in the byre end of the house shift and snort softly. Someone, probably your grandmother, coughs in her sleep, a deep, rattling sound that speaks of years breathing peat smoke. Did the smoke cause health problems? Absolutely, I admit. But it was a calculated trade-off, smoke-related lung issues later in life versus immediate survival. Pretty easy choice when you look at it that way. As you settle onto your bed, you notice something you rarely pay attention to. The smell. Your black house has its own unique scent profile. Peat smoke, wool lanolin, the earthy odour of the animals, dried herbs hanging from rafters, the mineral tang of the stone walls, the vegetative hint of the thatch. In this aroma is your entire world, every resource, every daily task, every survival strategy encoded in a complex olfactory fingerprint. It's a smell that would overwhelm modern visitors, but forms the background texture of your life. You couldn't sleep without it. It means safety, it means home. The wind begins to pick up outside, finding voice in the eaves, testing the strength of the thatch and the weight of the stones. The ropes creak slightly as they take the strain. The roof stones occasionally thud against the outer wall, not the frantic drumming of a full gale, but a warning rhythm. Margaret's bones were right. Storm's coming. But inside, protected by centuries of accumulated wisdom built into stone and earth and thatch, your family sleeps. The black house does what it was designed to do. It endures. It protects. It shelters life in one of the most inhospitable environments humans have chosen to inhabit. Your eyes grow heavy, your breathing slows. The last thing you register before sleep takes you is the soft orange glow of the peat embers, a tiny sun around which your entire world orbits. The hearth is the heart of the black house, but in a place where a single cow meant the difference between survival and starvation, what about the other end of the house, where the most valuable possessions weren't tools or treasures, but living, breathing animals? And that's where our story continues next. The Byre, where man and beast lived together in an ancient partnership that modern farming has all but forgotten. The storm Margaret predicted arrives with a vengeance. You wake to a sound like the world being torn apart, wind screaming around the black house, seeking any weakness, any gap to exploit. Rain hammers the thatch in sheets, and occasionally there's a sharp crack as a roof stone hits the outer wall. But inside is another world entirely. Your mother is already up, tending the peat fire that never goes out. The familiar earthy smell of smoke mingles with something else this morning, the rich, sweet scent of oatcakes cooking on a flat stone beside the flames, a luxury for a storm day when everyone will be trapped inside. "No peat cutting today," your father announces, as if anyone needed telling. "No fishing either. Today we mend." Storm days have their own rhythm in a black house. They're not days of rest. There's no such thing as a day off in this life, but they're days of different work, indoor work, repair work, the work that keeps everything else possible. So let me paint you a picture of what a storm day actually feels like inside a black house, I say. It's not the cold, isolated experience you might imagine. It's actually weirdly cozy. If you can get past the smoke and the smell. The sound is what strikes you most. The thick stone walls and dense thatch muffle the storm's fury to a distant roar, like hearing the ocean from inside a cave. The roof stones thump against the wall in a chaotic percussion, and beneath it all, from the other end of the black house, comes the soft, reassuring sounds of your family's most precious possessions, the animals. "Time to milk," your mother says, handing you a wooden pail worn smooth by generations of hands. You make your way to the Byre end of the house, where the family's livestock lives. In most black houses, this area is separated from the human living quarters by nothing more than a simple wooden partition or low stone wall. Some homes don't even have that. Just an open floor plan where animals and humans share the same space completely. Wait, they kept cows inside the house? I laugh. Yes, absolutely. And it wasn't because they were weird animal lovers. It was brilliant engineering. The byre end of your black house holds your family's wealth on 4 legs, a cow, 2 sheep, and sometimes in winter the pony used for carrying peat and other heavy loads. Right now, the cow is waiting patiently, steam rising from her warm body in the cool morning air. The floor here is different from the packed earth of the living area. It's paved with flat stones, sloping slightly toward a central channel that carries waste outside to a midden, the family's compost pile. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is wasted in this economy of survival. "Morning, Bramble," you murmur to the cow as you position the bucket. Your hands find their rhythm, the familiar squeeze-pull that extracts the milk. The cow's body radiates heat like a furnace, a contribution to the black house that goes far beyond the milk, meat, and leather she provides. A single cow produces about 1,500 British thermal units of heat per hour, I explain. That's roughly equivalent to a small space heater running continuously. In the confined space of a black house, this animal heat was a significant contributor to the family's comfort and survival. As you milk, your younger brother arrives with fresh bedding, straw and bracken gathered earlier and stored for such tasks. The old soiled bedding isn't discarded, it's added to the midden where it will decompose into fertilizer for the fields. In spring, this rich manure will help coax crops from the poor, thin soil, creating food that will sustain both humans and animals through another year. The whole system was circular, I tell you. Nothing wasted, everything with multiple purposes. The animals gave heat, food, and fertilizer. The humans provided shelter, care, and protection. It was a partnership more than ownership. Once the milking is done, you help your father with repairs. A section of the interior wall needs attention. Some of the smaller stones have shifted. It's not urgent, not structural, but in a black house, you fix small problems before they become big ones. That's the rule. Working beside him, you learn through observation more than instruction, how to select the right stone for each gap, how to position it so it locks into place with its neighbours, how to test it with a gentle push to ensure it won't shift again soon. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds pretty miserable, I interject. Cold, damp, smoky, sharing your house with livestock. But here's the thing. For these people, this wasn't deprivation. This was just life. They didn't sit around feeling sorry for themselves. They were too busy surviving, and sometimes even thriving. Outside, the storm reaches new heights. The roof stones are drumming faster now, and occasionally there's a new sound, a subtle shift in the thatch as the wind tests its strength. Your father pauses in his work, head tilted, listening intently. "The south corner," he says after a moment. "We'll need to check it when this passes." You're amazed at his ability to pinpoint the location of potential damage just from the sound. But that's another survival skill in this environment, developing an intimate knowledge of your shelter, being able to read its health like a doctor might read a patient's symptoms. The day progresses with indoor tasks. Your mother and sisters use the storm-enforced confinement to work wool, carding, spinning, weaving the sheep's contribution into fabric that will become clothing, blankets, and other essentials. The steady click of the loom creates a counterpoint to the storm's chaotic symphony. Your grandfather sits near the fire, using a small knife to carve a piece of driftwood into a new handle for a tool. Nothing goes to waste, not materials, not time, not energy. This is peak efficiency, I tell you. Modern society loves to talk about sustainability and zero waste. These people were living it centuries ago, not because they were environmentally conscious in the modern sense, but because waste meant death. Simple as that. Midday brings a simple meal of oatcakes and cheese made from Bramble's milk, supplemented with dried fish that's been hanging in the smoke. The family gathers around the central hearth, its warmth both physical and symbolic, the literal and figurative centre of Black House life. Conversation flows easily. There's discussion of repairs needed, of which fields might be planted with what crops when spring comes, of news from the last trading vessel to stop at the coast. Children chime in with their observations. Even the youngest are included. Their eyes and ears are assets to the family's collective awareness. You know what's missing from this picture? I ask. Hierarchy. Age was respected for the wisdom it brought, but everyone's input mattered because everyone's survival depended on collective knowledge. A 4-year-old might notice something about animal behavior that adults missed. A teenager might spot a weakness in the thatch that others overlooked. Everyone was a sensor in this survival system. After the meal, you check on the animals again. They seem unperturbed by the storm, accustomed to the sounds of wind and rain. The sheep stand together, their thick wool keeping them warm. The cow chews calmly, eyes half closed in bovine contentment. You realize, not for the first time, how much you depend on these creatures, not just for food and materials, but for their very presence. Their solid, warm bodies and steady heartbeats provide a reassurance that goes beyond the practical. In a world of uncertainty, they are constants. I spent way too long researching the relationship between crofters and their animals, I admit. Like, concerningly long, and what struck me was how different it was from modern farming. These weren't just economic assets, they were practically family members. As afternoon wears on, the Black House fills with more neighbours seeking shelter from the storm. Some have concerns about their own homes, a section of wall showing weakness or a portion of thatch that might not hold. They come for advice, for help, or sometimes just for the comfort of company during the storm's fury. This is community in its most essential form, not organised through institutions or schedules, but through the organic response to shared challenges. Your needs and knowledge are balanced with those of others, creating a resilience no individual or single family could achieve alone. An elderly neighbour, recently widowed, is given the warmest spot near the fire without comment or ceremony. A young mother with a fussy infant finds hands reaching out to hold the baby while she rests for a moment. A man with a gift for storytelling begins a tale to distract the children from the storm's frightening sounds. There's this idea that life back then was just endlessly brutal and isolated, I say. And don't get me wrong, it was incredibly hard, but there was this intense social connection that we've largely lost. When survival depends on community, you invest in those bonds in a way modern society rarely demands. As daylight begins to fade, though it's hard to tell with the storm-darkened sky, preparations for evening begin. Fresh peat is added to the fire. The animals are fed and checked once more. Food is prepared, simple but sustaining, stretched to accommodate the unexpected guests. This is when you notice something that has become so routine you rarely think about it. The smoke is behaving differently. With so many bodies in the Black House generating heat, the convection currents are stronger. The smoke rises more directly to the thatch instead of layering, creating better air quality at human level. It's like they built a living HVAC system, I explain. More people meant more heat, which meant better airflow, which meant less smoke at breathing level. Another unplanned benefit of community gathering during storms. Stories continue around the fire as night falls completely. Not just entertainment, though they are certainly that. These tales are vessels carrying essential knowledge. Which plants heal, which harm, how to read weather patterns, where to find food when usual sources fail, how ancestors survived similar challenges. This oral tradition is a library contained in memory rather than books. Every story adds to the collective wisdom that keeps the community alive. Children listen with wide eyes, absorbing not just the narrative but the embedded survival manual it contains. This was their version of Wikipedia, I laugh, except you couldn't just Google how to survive a Highland winter. You had to remember the stories, extract the useful information, and apply it when needed. The storm begins to ease around midnight. The wind's howl softens to a moan, then a sigh. The rain lightens from hammering to gentle pattering on the thatch. The roof stone's frantic drumming slows to occasional thumps. Neighbours begin to leave, returning to check on their own black houses. There are handshakes, embraces, murmured thanks. No formal acknowledgement of the shelter provided. That would suggest it was optional rather than expected. This is simply how the community functions. As you settle onto your straw bed, the black house around you creaks and shifts, not with weakness but with flexibility. The structure was designed to move slightly, to breathe with the pressure of the wind rather than rigidly resisting it. Like the people who built it, its strength comes from adaptation rather than immovability. Modern buildings are engineered not to move, I explain. These black houses were engineered to move just enough, to flex without breaking. There's a profound wisdom in that approach, both architecturally and philosophically. The storm has passed, but its lessons remain. Tomorrow will bring assessment of damage, community-wide repairs, perhaps redistribution of resources if some fared worse than others. The cycle of survival continues, with its challenges and solutions, its hardships and innovations. As sleep approaches, your mind drifts to the animals at the other end of the black house. Their breathing, their occasional soft movements create a gentle soundtrack that has accompanied your entire life. Modern humans might find it strange or off-putting to sleep so close to livestock. For you, their absence would be the unsettling thing. In that shared space, that mutual dependence, lies one of the core truths of the Black House. It wasn't just a human dwelling that happened to include animals. It was an integrated system where every element supported the others. The animals weren't just sheltered, they were integral to the shelter itself. Your modern bed, with its memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets, might be more comfortable than straw and wool in a smoke-filled stone house, but there's something you'll never experience, that bone-deep security of knowing that everything you need to survive is contained within these walls, a complete microsystem built to endure in one of the world's harshest environments. The last sounds you register before sleep claims you are the soft lowing of the cow, the gentle scraping of hooves on stone, the faint hiss of the peat fire, the lullaby of the Black House that has sent generations of Highland children to sleep. But the Black House story doesn't end within its walls. Tomorrow, you'll venture out to tend the precarious crops grown in the thin, rocky soil of the coast. You'll face the daily challenge of producing food in a place seemingly determined to prevent exactly that. And you'll discover that just as with the house itself, survival means working with the land rather than against it. Morning comes with the gentle touch of spring sunshine filtering through the thatch. The storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, glistening with raindrops that catch the light like scattered diamonds. After yesterday's confinement, the open air calls irresistibly. Your father stands at the door, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. Could have been worse, he finally declares. High praise in a place where optimism is tempered by constant pragmatism. or roof held, your grandfather adds, coming to stand beside him. Those stones of yours did their job. Today is for repair and recovery, but also for something else, something that happens only once a year. Today you'll help prepare the lazy beds, the raised cultivation ridges that represent your family's best hope for growing food in soil that seems determined to grow only rocks. Ready for some real work? Your father asks, and you nod, trying to match his matter-of-fact tone while suppressing your excitement. This is a rite of passage. Last year, you were deemed too young to help with this crucial task. This year, you're old enough to join the men in creating the foundation of your family's food supply. Okay, so picture this, I interrupt. These folks were farming on land that modern agricultural experts would write off as completely non-arable. We're talking thin, acidic, rocky soil with virtually no natural fertility. And yet, through sheer ingenuity, they managed to grow crops that kept their families alive. You follow your father and other men from the township down to the shore. The tide is out, revealing a bounty invisible at high water, seaweed, lots of it. Brown, slippery, salt-crusted tangles of kelp and bladderwrack thrown up by the recent storm. Good harvest today, someone comments. Storm's good for something at least. Everyone grabs pitchforks, homemade baskets, and any container that might serve. The race is against the returning tide, which will reclaim this gift from the sea in just a few hours. Get the bladderwrack first, your father instructs you. It's best for the lazy beds. You wade into the cold water, your legs immediately going numb. The seaweed is heavier than it looks, waterlogged and dense. You struggle to lift even small amounts with your pitchfork. Use your legs, not your back, an older man advises, demonstrating a leverage technique that makes the work marginally easier. You'll thank me when you're my age. For hours, the community works together, harvesting nature's bounty. Children too young for heavy lifting scramble along the shore, gathering smaller pieces in baskets. Women join in, their skirts hitched up and tied around their waists as they wade deeper than many men dare, seemingly impervious to the bone-chilling cold. I can't even begin to explain how important seaweed was to these communities, I say. It wasn't just fertilizer, it was also food in desperate times, medicine for various ailments, insulation material, even stuffing for mattresses. And then there was the kelp industry, but we'll get to that. By midday, impressive piles of seaweed dot the shore above the tide line. Now comes the truly back-breaking work, transporting it to the fields. Some fortunate families, yours included, have a small pony to help with this task. Others must rely entirely on human power, fashioning crude sledges or simply carrying impossible loads on their backs. Your pony, a sturdy little Highland beast named Fergus, seems distinctly unimpressed with today's labour, but he stands patiently as you and your father load seaweed onto the simple wooden drag he'll pull to the fields. Not too much, your father cautions, as you enthusiastically add another forkful. Fergus is strong, but no sense in wearing him out on the first trip. The fields waiting for this marine bounty lie a quarter-mile inland, small, irregular patches of ground deemed marginally less terrible than the surrounding landscape for growing crops. To your modern eyes, they'd still look hopelessly unsuitable for agriculture. Rocky, sloping, exposed to Atlantic gales. But beggars can't be choosers, especially when those beggars were forcibly relocated to this harsh coast during the clearances. So, the Highland clearances, quick refresher, I interject. Between 1750 and 1860, wealthy landowners realised they could make more money with sheep than with tenant farmers, so they evicted, sometimes violently, over 100,000 Highlanders from fertile inland valleys and either shipped them abroad or pushed them to these marginal coastal lands, places literally no one wanted. When you reach the field, you see neighbours already at work creating lazy beds. The technique is ancient, possibly dating back to prehistoric times, and brilliantly adapted to this challenging environment. First, parallel lines are marked out across the slope. Then comes the back-breaking work of building raised ridges. Turfs are cut and flipped grass side down. Seaweed is laid on top in thick, stinking layers. More turfs are added, building up a ridge about 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, with a ditch on either side for drainage. It looks like so much work because it absolutely was, I explain. But lazy beds, despite the misleading name, were an ingenious solution to multiple problems. The raised beds provided depth for roots in shallow soil. The ditches improved drainage in a waterlogged climate. And the layered construction created decomposition heat that extended the growing season. You join your father in cutting turfs with a specialised tool called a cascrome, essentially a foot-operated spade with a long wooden handle. It takes skill to cut uniform pieces, and your early attempts earn good-natured teasing from the more experienced workers. "Looks like you're boys cutting turfs for a fairy house," laughs one neighbour. "We folk need wee turfs, I suppose." Your face burns with embarrassment, but your father just nods at a particularly uneven section on the neighbour's own lazy bed. Glass houses, Angus, glass houses. The gentle ribbing continues throughout the day, but so does patient instruction. This is how knowledge transfers, through jokes, corrections, demonstrations, and endless repetition. No books, no formal teaching, just the accumulated wisdom of generations flowing from hand to hand, voice to voice. By late afternoon, your back screams in protest. Your hands, despite calluses built up from other work, are raw and bleeding in spots. The taste of salt and earth coats your mouth. Sweat and seawater have your clothes sticking uncomfortably to your skin. "Think we're soft now?" I ask. With our ergonomic chairs and repetitive strain injuries from typing, these people would laugh themselves sick at what we consider physical hardship. But there's satisfaction in looking back at the completed lazy beds. Tomorrow, precious seed potatoes will be planted in these ridges, potatoes being one of the few crops that can thrive in such conditions. If all goes well, each seed potato might yield 8 to 10 edible tubers. A multiplication of food that borders on miraculous in this environment. Will they grow? You ask your father, unable to hide the doubt in your voice as you look at the rough, seaweed-strewn mounds. He follows your gaze thoughtfully. They'll grow. Might not be pretty, might not be many, but they'll grow. He claps your shoulder. Stubborn things, potatoes, like us. On the way home, you pass another group engaged in a different task. Kelp burning. Large stone-lined pits on the shore contain smouldering piles of specific types of seaweed. The smoke is acrid, stinging your eyes and throat as you pass. "What's the difference?" you ask, gesturing between the seaweed you've been using for lazy beds and the kelp being burned. "That's for money," your father explains simply. "Ours is for food." The kelp industry was big business in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The burned kelp produced an alkaline ash used in glass and soap making, as well as for bleaching linen. For many coastal communities, it provided one of the few sources of actual cash income. The kelp industry is a whole other story, I tell you. At its peak in the early 1800s, it employed around 50,000 Highlanders. The irony is, some of the same landlords who cleared people from inland areas then prevented them from emigrating because they needed workers for the kelp harvest. People were treated as resources, just like the seaweed itself. Back at the Black House, your mother has been busy with her own seasonal task, spring cleaning, as much as such a concept can apply to a home with earthen floors and smoke-blackened walls. The central fire has been temporarily moved outside, a rare occurrence that happens only once or twice a year. The interior has been swept clean of accumulated debris. Fresh rushes have been scattered on the floor. The smokiest thatch has been removed and set aside for use as fertilizer, with new material ready to replace it. Spring cleaning wasn't just about appearances, I explain. It was about health and pest control. The fresh rushes on the floor contained natural oils that repelled insects. Replacing the smokiest thatch removed potential fire hazards while putting the nitrogen-rich material to use in the fields. The black house feels different with the fire outside. Cooler, less smoky, but somehow less alive. It reinforces how central the hearth is to this home, not just physically, but spiritually. Without its beating heart, the black house is just a stone shell. Your mother greets you with a critical eye for the state of your clothes, but a warm smile for the work completed. Good lazy beds this year. Best we could manage, your father answers. Boy did well. That simple comment, "boy did well," floods you with more pride than any elaborate modern praise. In this world of survival pragmatism, unnecessary words are rare. When they come, they matter. Dinner that evening is sparse. The hungry gap of spring is upon you, when winter stores are depleted and new growth hasn't yet yielded food. A thin broth with the last of the stored vegetables, stretched with oats and flavoured with precious salt. But there's milk from the cow and the promise of better meals to come if the lazy beds yield well. After eating, your father and grandfather inspect the seed potatoes being saved for tomorrow's planting. Each one is examined carefully for signs of disease or damage. The healthiest will become the foundation of next winter's survival. May not look like much, your grandfather says, holding up a particularly promising specimen. But there's life in these. Strong life. He should know. He's lived through the potato blight that devastated communities like yours in the 1840s. That catastrophe, less famous than the Irish famine but similarly devastating, killed thousands and forced many more to emigrate. Those who survived did so through desperate innovation, eating seaweed and shellfish when crops failed entirely. The Highland potato famine doesn't get the same attention as the Irish one, I note, but it was brutal. Between 1846 and 1856, it pushed already struggling communities to the absolute brink. Many landlords used the crisis as an excuse for more clearances, forcing emigration rather than providing relief. As darkness falls, neighbours begin to arrive, not in the numbers of a storm day, but a steady trickle. Their bodies show the same signs of exhaustion from similar work, but their faces carry satisfaction along with fatigue. Tonight's gathering has a different character than usual. There's purpose beyond simple community. Today was the first major communal work of the spring season, and tonight is for planning the next. Sheep shearing in 3 weeks, weather permitting, announces one of the older men who serves as an informal coordinator of community labour. Peat cutting to begin after that. Fishing crews will need to be organised for the summer season. These aren't suggestions, but statements of necessity. The agricultural calendar waits for no one, and every activity must happen in its appointed time if the community is to survive another year. You listen with new interest this year. For the first time, your name is mentioned among those assigned to certain tasks. You're no longer just a child to be minded, but a contributing member of the community's workforce. The responsibility sits both heavy and satisfying on your young shoulders. As the practical discussions wind down, the atmosphere relaxes. Someone produces a tin whistle. Another has a small drum fashioned from wood and goatskin. The music begins, simple, repetitive tunes that have accompanied Highland life for centuries. An elderly woman starts singing in Gaelic, her voice cracking with age but strong with emotion. You don't understand all the words. English has been increasingly forced upon your community, but you recognize the melody. It's a walking song, traditionally sung while beating newly woven cloth to soften it. The rhythmic nature made hard work pass more easily. Music wasn't just entertainment, I explain. It was a technology for getting work done. Songs had specific rhythms for specific tasks: rowing, weaving, harvesting. They synchronized community effort and made repetitive labor bearable. Other voices join in, creating harmonies that seem to make the very stones of the Black House vibrate in sympathy. Bodies exhausted from the day's labour nevertheless find energy for simple dances, hands clapping, feet stamping on the earthen floor. This is how these people have survived for generations in one of the world's most challenging environments, not just through technical innovation and physical endurance, but through a shared culture that binds them together, that transforms mere survival into something approaching joy, however briefly. As the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, you notice your grandfather sitting slightly apart, watching the younger people dance with a complex expression, part pride, part sorrow, part resignation. They think it will always be this way, he says quietly when he notices your attention. That we will always endure. Won't we? You ask, surprised by the uncharacteristic pessimism. He sighs. We're the last of a kind, lad. The world's changing. I feel it in these old bones, same as I feel the weather coming. You don't fully understand his words, but something in his tone lodges in your memory. A sense that this life, hard as it is, beautiful as it can sometimes be, exists on borrowed time. He wasn't wrong, I whisper. By the early 20th century, most black houses would be abandoned. Government regulations would eventually require the separation of human and animal dwellings. White houses with chimneys and separate byres would replace these ancient structures. As you drift towards sleep on your straw bed, the sounds of music and laughter still filtering through the Black House, you find yourself wondering about the world beyond your community. You've heard stories of cities where people live in multi-story buildings with glass windows, of farms on flat, stone-free land where crops grow tall without the back-breaking labour of lazy bed construction. It sounds like fantasy, a dream world as removed from reality as the fairy tales about selkies and water horses that entertain children on winter nights. Yet something in your grandfather's words suggests otherwise, that perhaps your way of life isn't the permanent, unchanging foundation you've always assumed it to be, but rather one moment in time, as transient in its own way as the seaweed thrown up by today's tide, only to be reclaimed by tomorrow's. The smoke from the rekindled central hearth wraps around you like a blanket, familiar and comforting. The animals shift and snort softly in their part of the Black House. Rain begins to patter on the thatch again, a gentle spring shower, nothing like yesterday's storm. These sounds, these smells, this reality is all you've ever known. It's hard to imagine any other way of being in the world. Yet change is coming, whether this community is ready for it or not. Forces beyond your understanding, economic, political, cultural, are already reshaping the Highlands, transforming not just how people live, but how they relate to the land and to each other. But that's a story for another time. For now, there are lazy beds to plant tomorrow, sheep to tend, and the eternal cycle of survival to maintain for another season, another year. Sleep comes easily to your exhausted body despite the deepening questions in your mind, and as consciousness fades, the last thing you register is the sound that has accompanied every night of your life, the soft breath of the Black House itself enduring one more day against the wind and rain of the Scottish coast. But what about the nights, when darkness falls early and stays late in the northern winter, when wind howls around the black house and nothing grows in the frozen ground? That's when survival becomes even more challenging, and when the black house truly proves its worth as a shelter against more than just the physical elements. Summer passes in a blur of constant labour, peat cutting, fishing, tending the lazy beds, shearing the sheep, spinning and weaving the wool, each day bleeding into the next with the rhythm of survival tasks that mark the crofter's life. Then suddenly, it seems, the light begins to change. The days shorten. The winds carry a chill that speaks of what's coming. Winter in the highlands approaches like a predator, patient, inevitable, deadly if you're not prepared. "Storms coming earlier this year," your grandfather remarks one evening, squinting at the sunset with eyes that have read weather patterns for over 7 decades. "Need to finish the harvest. Tomorrow." Your father nods, no argument or discussion needed. Grandfather's weather sense has kept the family alive through countless winters. When he says harvest tomorrow, you harvest tomorrow, even if traditional timing suggests otherwise. Dawn brings frantic activity as every able body in the community moves to bring in whatever crops have managed to grow in the stubborn, rocky soil. The potatoes from your lazy beds have done reasonably well, not a bounty by any means, but enough to see you through if carefully rationed. Barley has struggled more, but there will be some flour for bread, at least for a while. Ever notice how we romanticize harvest time? I interject. All those pretty paintings of abundant cornucopias and rosy-cheeked farmers. Yeah, real historical harvests were often desperate races against starvation, especially in places like this. By midday, dark clouds mass on the horizon, exactly as your grandfather predicted. The wind picks up, carrying the first spits of rain. Everyone works faster, fingers cramping, backs screaming in protest as they bend and dig and haul. The first real squall hits just as the last of the potatoes is carried indoors. Within minutes, the world outside transforms into a horizontal blur of wind and water. You stand in the doorway of your black house, watching nature's fury with a mixture of fear and relief. Fear of the long winter beginning, relief that you're not caught out in it. "Made it by a whisker," your father says, clapping your grandfather on the shoulder. The older man just nods, his weather prediction vindicated, but bringing him no particular joy. Being right about storms isn't cause for celebration when your life depends on it. It's just necessary. Inside, your mother and sisters are already processing the harvest, sorting potatoes by size and quality. The largest, healthiest ones go into a special basket. These are next year's seed potatoes, more precious than gold. The damaged ones will be eaten first before they can rot. The rest will be carefully stored in straw in the coolest part of the black house. Nothing wasted, your mother reminds everyone, though the reminder is hardly necessary. Not a scrap. So here's the thing about winter food storage before refrigeration, I say. It wasn't just about having enough calories, it was about managing decay, eating things in exactly the right order to minimize waste. As darkness falls early, your father and older brothers bring out tools that have been unused during the growing season. Knives for carving, awls for leatherwork, shuttles for the loom. Winter in the black house is not a time of rest, but of different work. Indoor work, craft work, the tasks that transform raw materials gathered during summer into finished goods needed for survival. "Hand me that piece," your father instructs, pointing to a particularly promising bit of driftwood collected months ago and carefully dried beside the fire. In his capable hands, it will become a new handle for a worn tool, or perhaps part of a loom, or a component of the many simple machines that make labour possible. Winter evenings in the Black House have their own distinct character. The central hearth burns longer as family members work by its light. The smoke, which during summer might feel stifling, is now a comforting presence, its familiar acrid scent mingling with the earthy smell of the animals in the byre, the lanolin from wool being processed, and the sweat of bodies working in close proximity. Let me just paint you a picture of what this actually looks like, I say. Imagine the orange glow of peat embers as the only light source, shadows dancing on stone walls, the soft sounds of animals breathing at one end of the house, the click of needles as women knit, the scrape of knives on wood as men carve, children practicing simple tasks or playing quiet games with pebbles or bits of bone fashioned into toys, all within a space roughly the size of a modern living room. Tonight, as the storm rages outside, testing the strength of your thatch and the weight of your roof stones, the Black House does what it was designed to do. It protects. The wind may scream and claw at the walls, but inside, your family continues the work of survival, barely acknowledging the tempest, except when a particularly strong gust causes everyone to pause momentarily, gauging whether this storm falls within normal parameters or presents a genuine threat. As the evening deepens, neighbours begin to arrive, not fleeing the storm as they might during summer, but deliberately choosing to venture through it. Winter nights in the Highlands are long, dark, and isolating. The antidote, developed over centuries, is the chaili, not the formal dance event of modern times, but its ancestor. A simple gathering of community for storytelling, music, and the sharing of work. You have to understand what darkness really meant back then, I explain. Not the mild inconvenience we experience during a power outage, but a profound, enveloping absence of light that stretched from mid-afternoon until late morning during deep winter. Gathering together wasn't just social, it was psychologically essential. The neighbours arrive in twos and threes, stamping feet and shaking off rain at the door. Each brings something, a bit of work to do, an instrument, perhaps a small offering of food if they can spare it. No one arrives empty-handed. That's not the way here. As more bodies fill the Black House, the temperature noticeably rises. What modern visitors might find uncomfortably close quarters is, in winter, a vital heat conservation strategy. Body warmth becomes a communal resource shared as readily as stories or songs. Angus! Tell us about the Selkie bride, a child calls out to an elderly man settling himself near the fire. The old man makes a show of reluctance, but the gleam in his eye tells you he's already preparing the tale in his mind. Well now, he begins, voice dropping to just above a whisper so everyone must lean in slightly to hear. There was a fisherman on the outer islands, a lonely man with nothing but his boat and his songs. The tale unfolds with practiced rhythm, the old man's voice rising and falling like the sea itself. It's a story you've heard before, many times, but that doesn't matter. In a world without books or recordings, repetition is how knowledge survives. Besides, each telling brings subtle variations, the story breathing and evolving like a living thing passed from generation to generation. You notice something as you look around the crowded Black House, the unique way firelight plays on the faces of your community, highlighting the deep lines carved by weather and work, the eyes that have seen hardship but still hold warmth, the hands that are never truly at rest even in moments of recreation. These are people shaped by this harsh landscape as surely as the stones of the Black House were shaped by need and function. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, I point out. It was the Wikipedia, the university, the news service, and the psychological counselling of their time, all rolled into one. Stories contained practical knowledge, moral guidance, warnings about natural dangers, and models for handling grief and hardship. The evening progresses with more stories, then songs, work songs with rhythms that match the tasks they traditionally accompany, love songs that speak of separation and longing, laments for lost lands that bring tears to older eyes. The Highland clearances may have happened decades ago for some families, but the wound remains fresh, a cultural trauma passed down through lyrics and melodies. During a pause between songs, an argument breaks out, good-natured but passionate, about the best technique for smoking fish. Two older men have dramatically different approaches, each convinced his method produces superior results. "My father did it this way, his father before him," one insists, demonstrating a particular hanging technique with broad gestures. "Aye, and that explains the perpetual hunger in your family," the other retorts, generating appreciative laughter from the crowd. What might seem like a trivial disagreement is actually the continuation of an essential knowledge transmission system. These debates over fishing techniques, weather predictions, animal husbandry, construction methods are how best practices are established and refined. It's peer review without academic journals, quality control without industrial standards. In communities where writing is uncommon and books rare, this is how you preserve critical information, I explain. You argue about it, you tell stories about it, you encode it in songs, you make sure multiple people know each technique, so if one dies, the knowledge doesn't die with them. As midnight approaches, the gathering begins to disperse, people returning to their own black houses through the storm. The weather has actually become a benefit now. The shared adversity of facing the wind and rain creates natural walking groups, ensuring no one faces the darkness alone. Your family settles for the night, the black house feeling suddenly larger and quieter with the departure of guests. The fire is banked carefully, damped down but never ever extinguished. The animals in the byre shift and snort as they too prepare for sleep. Your grandfather, instead of heading to his sleeping area, beckons you to join him near the embers of the fire. This is unusual. Normally, bedtime is non-negotiable, especially for children. "Want to show you something?" he says quietly, unwrapping a small package from within his coat. It's a book, one of perhaps 3 your family owns, and easily the most precious. "Can't sleep," he explains. "Storm nights remind me too much of the clearance." You sit beside him, honoured by this rare moment of confidence. Your grandfather was just a boy when your family was forced from their inland home, more fertile land that had supported your ancestors for countless generations. The trauma of that eviction still haunts him. The sight of the burning thatch as landlords ensured no one could return. The long march to the coast with whatever possessions could be carried, the first desperate winter trying to create shelter in this inhospitable place. "They gave us one day," he says, echoing the stories you've heard at Seaweed's. "One day to leave behind everything but what we could carry." The book he's unwrapped contains handwritten records, births, deaths, marriages, but also descriptions of the inland farm, detailed notes on the farming techniques that worked there, knowledge preserved not through oral tradition, but through the rare luxury of literacy possessed by some ancestor. "Can't read it myself," he admits. "Your father can show you someday. Important to know where we came from, who we were before." He gestures vaguely at the stone walls around you. The psychological impact of the clearances can't be overstated, I interject softly. Imagine being told that sheep are more valuable than your entire community, that generations of your family's work meant nothing compared to potential wool profits, then being forced to remake your entire life on land that could barely support human existence. You listen as your grandfather speaks more openly than you've ever heard, sharing memories he usually keeps locked tightly away. The black house around you takes on new meaning, not just a clever adaptation to harsh conditions, but a symbol of resilience after devastation, of a people who refused to disappear even when the powers of the day decided they should. We endured, he concludes simply, rewrapping the precious book. Remember that. Later, lying on your straw bed, you find yourself newly aware of the black house around you, the stones that your displaced ancestors gathered and fitted by hand, the roof crafted from whatever materials could be found, the careful integration of humans and animals into a single survival system. Not just a home, but a statement. We are still here. Sleep comes with dreams of places you've never seen, the fertile valleys of your family's ancestral lands, green and sheltered in ways this coastal edge can never be. You wonder if some cellular memory has preserved these images, passed down through generations, along with the techniques for building walls and cutting peat. Morning arrives with a temporary break in the storm. Your father stands at the door, assessing. Good day for the fish traps, he announces. Storms drive them closer to shore, and so winter life in the black house continues, a constant calculation of weather opportunities, resource management, and work allocation. The storm might give you fish today, but prevent peat gathering tomorrow. Each decision a complex equation with survival as the only acceptable solution. Your mother sorts through stores of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, selecting those needed for a poultice for your sister's persistent cough. Medical knowledge here isn't separate from everyday life. It's integrated into the rhythm of household management, another set of skills passed from mother to daughter through demonstration and practice. You know, modern people tend to compartmentalize knowledge, I observe. Medicine is separate from cooking, is separate from building. But in Black House life, it was all one continuous body of survival information. The same woman who wove your blanket also knew which plants would bring down a fever and how to deliver a breech calf. Midday brings an unexpected visitor, the factor, representative of the landlord who owns all this land despite never setting foot on it. His arrival causes an immediate tension in the black house. Your father's face hardens. Your mother busies herself making the factor a reluctant cup of tea. Rent day next week, the factor announces without preamble. Laird expects prompt payment. Weather's been poor for kelping, your father responds carefully. Fish have been scarce. The factor shrugs, unmoved. Not the laird's concern, payment in cash or goods or work at the big house. His eyes scan the black house interior, noting the meagre winter stores. Your choice, of course. The threat is implicit but clear. Failure to pay rent could mean eviction even in winter. Even after decades of working this marginal land, making it productive against all odds, your family has no security of tenure, no legal right to remain. After the factor leaves, a heavy silence fills the black house. This is the shadow that hangs over all your careful preparations, your ingenious adaptations, your community solidarity, the ever-present knowledge that none of it belongs to you, not the land, not even the stones of the house your own hands built. The relationship between Highland crofters and landlords was fundamentally feudal well into the 19th century, I explain. Imagine pouring your life into making barely arable land productive, only to live with constant anxiety that it could be taken away on a landlord's whim. Your father paces the small interior, calculating resources, considering options. Will it be kelp gathering despite dangerous winter seas, extra fishing regardless of conditions, sending your older brother to work at the landlord's house, losing his labour here but gaining credit toward the rent? "We'll manage," he finally says, a phrase you've heard countless times before. Not optimism, not denial, but simple determination. We'll manage, because the alternative is unthinkable. That evening, as another storm builds outside, your father takes down the family's most treasured possession, a fiddle carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the damp and smoke. Music in the Black House isn't a luxury, but a necessity, a way to express emotions too complex for words, to strengthen bonds strained by constant proximity and shared hardship. The first notes rise toward the smoke-blackened rafters, a slow air that speaks of loss and longing, but also stubborn hope. Your mother begins to hum along, then your grandmother adds her wavering soprano. Soon everyone is contributing, tapping rhythm on knees, adding harmonies, transforming individual anxiety into collective expression. This is how you survive winter in a black house on the edge of Scotland, not just through walls and thatch, peat and potatoes, but through the invisible architecture of community, the shared weight of memory, the human capacity to create meaning and beauty even in the harshest circumstances. Outside, the winter storm renews its assault on your stone walls. Inside, the music rises in defiance. Both will continue until spring brings its own challenges and opportunities. For now, the Black House holds not just the physical structure, but the complex cultural ecosystem it contains. And at the heart of it all, the peat fire burns steadily, as it has for generations, as your grandfather insists it must always do, a small, constant flame against the vast darkness of a Highland winter. But what about the inner warmth, the sense of identity that helped these people endure not just physical challenges, but cultural destruction? How did Black House dwellers maintain their spiritual and emotional lives in the face of forces determined to erase their way of being? That's where our story continues. Deepest winter settles over the coast like a heavy blanket, muffling the world outside your Black House. Days shrink to brief glimpses of grey light between long stretches of darkness. For weeks now, the community has existed in a holding pattern, venturing out only when absolutely necessary, conserving resources, turning inward. Tonight is special, though. It's the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. In the Black House, this isn't just an astronomical curiosity, but a significant moment in the cycle of survival. After tonight, incrementally, the light begins its slow return. Your grandfather sits by the central hearth, more talkative than usual. The solstice seems to have loosened something in him, allowing memories and knowledge to flow that are usually kept carefully contained. "When I was a boy," he begins, voice low so only you can hear. "Before the minister came, we'd celebrate this night properly." You lean in, curious. The local minister, a stern Presbyterian who views most traditional practices as dangerously close to paganism, has been a force in the community for 15 years now. Many old customs have gone underground in that time, practiced in whispers or abandoned entirely. "How did you celebrate?" you ask. He smiles, the firelight deepening the lines on his face. "We'd keep the fire burning extra bright all night, leave offerings, just a bit of bread, a splash of precious milk, for the spirits of those who came before, ask their protection through the dark months." The minister says, "That's superstition," you whisper back, repeating what you've heard in Sunday sermons. Your grandfather's smile turns wry. "Aye, he would, but tell me this, is it superstition to remember where you came from, to honour those whose knowledge keeps you alive?" I spent ages researching the religious and spiritual tensions in these communities, I interject. The clash between ancient folk beliefs and Presbyterian Christianity created this fascinating spiritual hybrid in many Black House communities. They'd go to church on Sunday, then come home and quietly maintain traditions that predated Christianity by centuries. The The central fire pops and crackles, sending a shower of sparks upward. Your grandfather nods toward it significantly. Fire's been sacred since before churches existed. People have gathered around flames like this for thousands of years, finding meaning in its light. This kind of talk makes you both nervous and intrigued. The minister would certainly disapprove, yet there's something compelling about these older traditions, these connections to a past that stretches back before written records. The cultural erasure that accompanied the Highland clearances wasn't just about land, I explain. It was also about identity, language, customs, spiritual practices. All were systematically suppressed as backward or pagan. Speaking Gaelic was punished in schools. Traditional music was discouraged. Even the Black House itself was eventually condemned as primitive and unhygienic. Your father joins you by the fire. Having overheard parts of the conversation, he seems uncomfortable but doesn't shut it down entirely. Different times now, he says simply. We adapt, but we don't forget, your grandfather adds firmly. There's tension between them. Not anger, but a fundamental difference in approach to survival. Your father focuses on pragmatic adaptation to changing demands. Your grandfather insists on maintaining connections to what came before. Both strategies have merit. Neither is sufficient alone. This generational tension was super common, I note. The older folks who remembered life before displacement often clung to traditions, while their children might be more willing to adopt new ways if it meant avoiding further persecution. It created this painful dynamic where adapting to survive sometimes meant letting go of pieces of identity. The solstice night deepens. Your mother and sisters have gone to bed, but many in the household remain awake, keeping the traditional vigil without explicitly naming it as such. The fire is built up higher than usual. Stories flow more freely. Even your father, despite his caution, eventually begins recounting tales heard from his own grandfather. He swore he once saw the blue men in the Minch, he tells you, referring to the mythical sea spirits said to challenge sailors to poetry contests. Said they capsized boats that couldn't match their verses. That's so? Your grandfather asks, a glint in his eye. And did he happen to mention what rhymes might save a poor sailor? Your father actually laughs, a rare sound in these difficult months, and launches into a complex Gaelic verse. The words are mostly unfamiliar to you. English has been increasingly enforced in school, but the rhythm feels somehow known, as if your body remembers what your mind has not been permitted to retain. The language loss was catastrophic, I say quietly. Imagine having the words for specific states of sea and sky, particular techniques for building or farming, complex emotional concepts, and then being forced to use a different language that lacks those precise terms. So much knowledge was embedded in Gaelic that simply couldn't be perfectly translated. As the night progresses, more neighbours arrive, not for a formal sailie, but for the comfort of company on this longest night. No one explicitly mentions the old traditions, but you notice small gestures, an extra piece of peat added to the fire with particular care, a murmured phrase that might be prayer or might be something older, meaningful glances exchanged when the minister's name arises in conversation. This is how cultural resistance works, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through these tiny continuities, these stubborn refusals to completely abandon what came before. The Black House itself, with its ancient design principles barely changed over centuries, stands as a physical embodiment of this resistance. People often think of resistance as dramatic acts of rebellion, I observe, but sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply continuing to exist in a way that power structures have tried to erase. Building black houses the way ancestors did, telling stories that preserve forgotten knowledge, using phrases from a discouraged language. These weren't just nostalgic acts, they were political ones. The conversation turns, as it often does during winter nights, to the practical challenges of survival. This winter has been particularly harsh. Food stores are dwindling faster than ideal. The peat stack has diminished alarmingly. We'll need to be stricter with the rationing, your father announces, no judgment in his voice, just the cool assessment of necessity. No one argues. Everyone understands the mathematics of survival. Make the supplies last until new resources become available or face the consequences. Hold up, I say. Let me paint this picture properly. Food rationing in a Black House winter wasn't like modern dieting or cutting back. It was a deadly serious calculation, exactly how few calories each person could consume and still perform essential tasks, multiplied by exactly how many days until new food sources might become available. Miscalculate and people died. Simple as that. A neighbour brings up a community concern. The McLean family, whose father broke his leg in a fishing accident last month. Their situation is becoming desperate without his labour. Without discussion, several people immediately offer small contributions from their own meagre stores. A few potatoes here, a bit of dried fish there. Not enough to solve the problem entirely, but enough to extend the timeline for a solution. This, too, is part of Black House culture, the recognition that individual survival is impossible. Only community ensures continuation. The most successful survival strategy wasn't individual strength or even family resilience, I point out. It was community cohesion. One family alone in a Black House, no matter how skilled, was vulnerable. 10 families supporting each other could absorb setbacks that would destroy a solitary household. The night wears on. Children who tried to stay awake for the adult conversations have long since drifted to sleep, curled on benches or directly on the floor near the fire. Conversations fragment and reform like the patterns in the peat flames. Your grandfather motions you closer again, his voice dropping even lower. Important to remember something, he says, eyes on the fire rather than your face. This life, it's hard, no denying, but it's not just hardship, there's beauty in it too. You follow his gaze into the heart of the glowing peat. What kind of beauty? His weathered hand makes a gesture that somehow encompasses the entire Black House, the sleeping children, the community members sharing stories, the animals shifting quietly in the byre, the play of firelight on ancient stone walls. This, he says simply, being together, knowing your place in the world, understanding the land and sea and sky well enough to survive by them. Most folks now live their whole lives without ever truly knowing where they are. You're not entirely sure what he means, but something in his tone suggests importance, so you nod and store the words away to consider later. That sense of place, of belonging, was something these communities had that many modern people lack, I explain. Despite, or maybe because of, the harsh conditions, they developed this profound relationship with their specific environment. They could read the landscape like we read text, perceiving subtle signals and changes invisible to outsiders. As midnight approaches, conversation dwindles. The fire is carefully banked to last the night. Neighbours depart for their own black houses, borrowing burning peat if needed to revive their own fires, another ancient practice that serves both practical need and symbolic connection. Your family settles for sleep, but you find yourself restless, aware of the significance of this longest night. From your straw bed, you watch the faint orange glow of the embers painting patterns on the stone walls, listening to the breathing of your family members and the occasional soft sounds from the animals. This is when you notice something you rarely pay attention to, how the Black House breathes with its inhabitants, the slight movement of air through the thatch carrying away some smoke, the almost imperceptible expansion and contraction of the walls with temperature changes. The way the whole structure seems to huddle against the winter wind, just as the bodies inside huddle together for warmth. The black house was practically a living organism, I say softly, constantly adjusting, adapting, responding to conditions. Modern buildings are designed to be static, unchanging. These structures were designed to flex, to breathe, to age and transform over time, just like the people who built them. Sleep eventually claims you, deep and dreamless in the profound darkness. When you wake, it's to complete blackness and the sounds of your father and brothers preparing to go out. Time to check the fishing creels placed yesterday, to bring in water, to tend to essential outside tasks during the brief daylight. Storms past, your father announces. Good light today. After the men leave, the black house settles into its women's rhythm. A different kind of day begins. Your mother instructs you to bring more peat inside while she tends the fire. Your sisters are already at work processing wool, their fingers flying despite the cold. The interior of the black house looks different in winter morning light filtering through the open door, the smoke hanging lower without the day's heat to lift it, the walls seeming somehow closer, the central hearth a precious island of warmth in a sea of chill. "Wait!" your mother says suddenly, interrupting her own task. "Listen." Everyone freezes, straining to hear whatever has caught her attention. At first, there's nothing, just the normal creaks and shifts of the black house, the soft sounds of animals. Then you catch it, a faint high keening coming from the byre end of the house. "The ewe," your mother says, already moving. "Her time's come early." This is unexpected. The pregnant sheep wasn't due to deliver until closer to spring. A winter lamb is a mixed blessing. New life and potential resources, but additional drain on limited feed and serious risk to the animal's survival. The next hours transform the black house into a birthing chamber. The ewe is carefully separated from other animals, given the cleanest available bedding. Your mother sends you to a neighbor's house to borrow special herbs kept for difficult births. Your sisters heat water, prepare clean cloths. Birth was a community event, I explain. Not just human births, but animal ones too. Everyone had a role to play, knowledge to contribute. Children learned by watching and assisting from the youngest ages. Nothing was hidden away or compartmentalized. Life and death were visible integrated parts of Black House existence. The labor is difficult. The ewe struggles, clearly exhausted. Your mother works with quiet efficiency, her hands gentle but firm as she helps position the lamb. There are no veterinarians here, no modern medicines, just generations of hard-won knowledge passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. "One more push," your mother murmurs to the animal, as if it could understand her words. Maybe it's the tone that matters, the human-animal connection that transcends language. Finally, with a rush of fluid and a collective exhale from all the humans present, the lamb arrives, tiny, wet, seemingly lifeless. Your mother immediately clears its nostrils and mouth, rubs its chest vigorously. For a terrifying moment, nothing happens. Then the lamb gives a small shudder and gasps its first breath. "There we are," your mother says softly, satisfaction warming her voice. "Stubborn one, just like your dam." The black house fills with a palpable sense of relief and quiet joy. New life in deepest winter is a potent symbol, a reminder that renewal comes even in the darkest times. The practical challenges remain, extra care needed, precious resources diverted, but for this moment, those concerns are secondary to the simple miracle of continuation. Life and death happened right there in the black house, I note, not sanitized or separated like in modern experience. A lamb born on the earthen floor, an elderly relative drawing their last breath by the same hearth where babies were delivered, all part of the same continuous cycle, visible and integrated into daily existence. When your father and brothers return successful from their fishing expedition, the Black House truly comes alive. Fresh fish will supplement the dwindling stores, a welcome addition to the winter diet. The news of the lamb's birth is greeted with raised eyebrows, concern about the timing mixed with appreciation for any increase to the flock. Your father examines the newborn carefully. Small, but seems strong enough. Good lineage. He nods at your mother's work approvingly. Well done. High praise by his taciturn standards. The day continues with processing the fish. Some will be eaten fresh tonight, a rare winter luxury. The rest will be preserved by salting or smoking, adding to the stores that must last until spring brings new opportunities. Nothing is wasted. Heads and bones will flavour broth. Entrails will be used as garden fertiliser when the ground thaws. By evening, the Black House has transformed again, from birthing chamber to processing station to communal dining room as neighbours arrive to share in the modest bounty of fresh fish. This is tradition too, the understanding that good fortune must be distributed, creating obligations that will be repaid when situations reverse. The fish wouldn't have lasted anyway without refrigeration, I explained, but even if it could have been preserved, the social obligation to share was more valuable long-term than hoarding resources. It created a web of mutual debt and gratitude that ensured no one was left completely vulnerable. As the brief winter day fades to darkness, the Black House becomes a sanctuary of light and warmth against the pressing night. The fresh fish makes a simple but satisfying meal, stretched with potatoes and whatever greens could be coaxed from the winter garden. Conversation flows more easily with full bellies. Stories emerge. Some you've heard countless times, some new even to the oldest listeners. This oral tradition isn't just entertainment. It's the community's archive, its institutional memory, its collective wisdom maintained without writing or records. Before mass literacy, people developed incredible memory techniques, I point out. They could recite genealogies going back 20 generations. They memorized hundreds of medicinal plant uses, weather patterns over decades, complex navigational knowledge. The human brain properly trained is an astonishing storage device. Tonight, someone recounts the story of the great storm of 40 years past, how 3 black houses were damaged beyond repair, how the community rallied to rebuild them before winter's grip tightened further, how techniques were improvised that have since become standard practice. This isn't just nostalgia, it's practical knowledge transfer wrapped in narrative, how to respond to disaster, how to mobilize community resources, how to innovate under pressure. The children listening aren't just being entertained, they're being prepared for challenges they may face in their own lives. As the night deepens and the solstice vigil comes to its natural conclusion, you find yourself watching the Black House with new eyes, seeing not just the physical structure, but the invisible bonds it contains and creates, the architecture of community and continuity that has allowed your people to survive displacement, harsh conditions, cultural suppression, and the constant threat of starvation. The Black House isn't just a shelter against weather, it's a fortress protecting something much more vulnerable and precious, a way of being in the world, a set of relationships between people, animals, and landscape that has been developed over countless generations of trial and error. So many survival strategies were embedded in the Black House design and in the culture it contained, I say quietly, and as these buildings eventually disappeared, replaced by more modern structures, something profound was lost, not just architectural knowledge, but an entire way of relating to the world and to each other. As sleep approaches on this longest night, the Black House holds you in its stone embrace, the centuries-old design doing what it has always done, creating a pocket of survivable conditions in an environment that would otherwise be lethal. The walls, the roof, the central hearth, the animals at the other end, all parts of an integrated system developed through generations of refinement. But even as you drift toward dreams, a question lingers from your grandfather's earlier comments. This life, with all its hardships and beauty, how much longer can it continue? What forces from the outside world might already be gathering that will transform this ancient way of being beyond recognition? And that's where our final chapter begins, with the legacy of the Black House and what happened when the modern world finally reached even these remote coastal communities. Spring arrives reluctantly to the Scottish coast, teasing with brief moments of warmth followed by sharp returns to winter's bite. But gradually, undeniably, the world begins to change. Days lengthen. The first tentative green appears on the hillsides. Birds return from southern migrations, their calls a welcome counterpoint to winter's silence. In the Black House, a different kind of awakening occurs. The heaviness of winter confinement lifts. Windows, simple openings in the thick walls, covered with oiled cloth instead of glass, are uncovered to admit fresh air. The constant peat smoke thins as the fire can be allowed to die down during warmer days. This morning, your grandfather sits outside the Black House door, face turned toward the strengthening sun like a plant seeking light after months in shadow. You join him, enjoying the simple pleasure of warmth on your skin. Feels like resurrection, he says quietly, eyes still closed against the brightness. You understand exactly what he means. After months of darkness and confinement, this emergence feels like coming back to life. The winter was particularly harsh this year. Resources stretched to breaking point. Several elderly community members didn't survive, including Margaret, whose weather predictions had guided community decisions for decades. Every spring was a victory, I tell you. Making it through a Highland winter wasn't guaranteed. Each person who survived had essentially won a brutal endurance contest against conditions specifically designed to kill them. Your grandfather opens his eyes, surveying the coastal landscape coming back to life. When I was a boy, he begins, falling into the familiar rhythm of story sharing. My own grandfather told me things were changing, said the old ways couldn't last forever. What did he mean, you ask? Meant this life? He gestures toward the Black House, the small plot of hard-won cultivation, the grazing lands beyond, said the world was shrinking, that someday there'd be no place remote enough to live as we do. You try to imagine it, a world where the Black House way of life no longer exists. It seems impossible. What could possibly replace this ancient, tested system of survival? He wasn't wrong, I interject. The Black House era was already ending. Government regulations would soon require the separation of animals and humans. Economic pressures would make traditional crofting increasingly unviable. The final exodus was beginning, not forced by landlords this time, but by the inexorable pressure of modernization. The conversation is interrupted by your father calling from inside. The day's work cannot wait for philosophical discussions. Spring brings its own demanding rhythm of labour. Seeds must be planted, peat must be cut, animals must be tended. The Black House itself needs post-winter repairs. Patches to the thatch, reinforcement of walls weathered by months of storms. Go on, your grandfather says. I'll join you shortly. Inside, the Black House hums with activity. Your mother and sisters sort through precious seed potatoes, selecting the strongest for planting. Your brothers prepare tools that have lain mostly dormant through winter. Your father studies a damaged section of the inner wall, planning repairs. Need to replace that stone, he says when he notices you watching. Winter frost got into a crack, split it clean through. The Black House is not a static structure, but a constant work in progress, adapting, being repaired, evolving with the needs and resources of its inhabitants. This relationship between dwelling and dweller is fundamentally different from modern housing, more intimate, more responsive, more demanding of both parties. Modern buildings are designed to resist change, I explain. Black houses were designed to accommodate it. They weren't expected to remain unchanged for decades. They breathed, shifted, settled, and required ongoing dialogue with their inhabitants. Your father hands you a hammer-like tool. "Show me what you've learned about wall work," he says, stepping back to observe. This is how knowledge transfers in your world, not through formal instruction, but through demonstration, observation, and supervised practice. You've watched countless wall repairs since you were old enough to toddle around the Black House. Now it's time to prove you've absorbed the lessons. You select replacement stones carefully, testing how they fit together, seeking the natural points of contact where they'll lock most securely. The work is slow, deliberate, more like solving a puzzle than following a blueprint. Your father watches silently, offering neither criticism nor praise until you've finished. "It'll hold," he says finally, his highest compliment. I spent forever researching how these skills were taught, I admit. There were no manuals, no formal apprenticeships for most Black House skills. It was all transmitted through what anthropologists call legitimate peripheral participation, basically hanging around, watching, helping with simple tasks, and gradually taking on more complex ones as you proved capability. The day passes in a blur of spring preparations. By evening, exhaustion settles deep in your muscles, a different kind from winter's forced inactivity. This is the productive tiredness of necessary work, of forward motion, of investment in future survival. After dinner, still meagre as winter stores dwindle and spring has yet to provide abundance, conversation turns to community matters. A government inspector is rumoured to be coming soon, assessing housing conditions throughout the region. They say he's closing down black houses in the southern townships, your father reports, concern evident beneath his usual stoic expression, calling them unsanitary, forcing people to build new homes with separate buyers. What happens to folks who can't afford new buildings? Your mother asks the practical question on everyone's mind. Your father shrugs. Government doesn't seem concerned with that detail. This was the beginning of the end for traditional black houses, I explain. New health regulations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries required the separation of humans and animals under different roofs. This might seem reasonable from a modern perspective, but it fundamentally broke the integrated system that made black house living possible in such harsh conditions. That night, sleep comes fitfully despite your physical exhaustion. The conversation about change, about threats to your way of life, has stirred anxieties normally kept at bay by the immediate demands of survival. You find yourself studying the black house in the dim glow of banked embers, memorizing its contours, its smells, its sounds, as if somehow sensing its impermanence. Morning brings an unexpected visitor, the factor again, but this time accompanied by a stranger in city clothes carrying a notebook and what appears to be a camera, an extreme rarity in your remote community. "Government man," your father mutters as they approach. "Brace yourself." The inspector enters the black house with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, making no attempt to hide his distaste for the smoke, the earthen floor, the proximity of animals. He takes notes, photographs, measurements, all while asking clipped questions about family size, livestock numbers, illness frequency. Your father answers with minimal politeness, offering nothing beyond what's directly asked. Your mother remains silent, a calculated invisibility that generations of Highland women have perfected when dealing with authorities. "When was this structure built?" the inspector demands, poking at a wall with his walking stick as if expecting it to collapse. "My grandfather's time," your father answers vaguely. The inspector makes a note. Quite primitive. No proper chimney, no separation from animals, inadequate ventilation, exactly the conditions we're being instructed to eliminate. Your grandfather, who has remained in the background until now, steps forward. "This house has sheltered 6 generations of our family," he says, voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel. "We're still here. Perhaps that suggests it works better than you understand." The inspector barely glances at him. "Sentiment doesn't prevent disease, old man. Progress is coming, whether you welcome it or not." After they leave, a heavy silence fills the black house. The inspection feels like violation, not just of your physical space, but of the entire way of life it represents. The clear contempt in the inspector's eyes, his dismissal of generations of survival knowledge as primitive ignorance, has left a wound deeper than any winter storm. "The cultural arrogance was staggering," I interject. "These government officials had no understanding of the integrated system they were dismantling, how the smoke preserved the thatch and created antibacterial conditions, how the animal heat was essential for winter survival, how the whole structure worked as a single organism adapted to specific environmental conditions." Weeks pass. Spring establishes itself more confidently. The community falls back into familiar seasonal rhythms: planting, fishing, peat cutting, animal husbandry. But beneath these activities runs a current of unease, a sense that external forces are gathering that may prove more destructive than any natural challenge yet faced. Word comes from neighbouring townships that eviction notices have been served on black house dwellers who cannot or will not comply with new building regulations. Some are being relocated to purpose-built crofting communities with approved housing designs. Others are simply being displaced, forced to seek work in coastal towns or distant cities. "So they're doing it again," your grandfather says bitterly when the news reaches your family. "Different words, same result, clearing us from the land." "It's not the same," your father argues, though without much conviction. "They're not taking the land, just changing the buildings. When you change how people can live on the land, you change who can live on it," your grandfather responds. Same result in the end. "That's actually profound as hell," I note. Your grandfather identified something modern society still struggles with, that architectural requirements are a form of social engineering, determining who can afford to live where and how. The debate continues within your family, mirrored throughout the community. Some argue for adaptation, build the new regulated houses, separate the animals, install proper chimneys. Others, like your grandfather, see these changes as the final assault on a way of life that has already weathered displacement, cultural suppression, and economic marginalization. The thing is, I explain, both sides had valid points. The black house design did have health disadvantages by modern standards. The smoke caused respiratory issues, animal proximity created certain disease risks, but the alternatives being offered weren't necessarily better adapted to the specific challenges of Highland coastal living. Summer arrives with unusual warmth, transforming the landscape. The community's mood lifts with the improved weather and growing crops. The pressure of regulatory changes recedes temporarily. The inspector has moved on to other townships, and no immediate action has been required of your family. Your black house stands as it has for generations, still functioning exactly as designed, but now you look at it with different eyes, seeing not just its practical features, but its vulnerability to forces beyond weather and seasons. Its continued existence depends not just on the community's skill and determination, but on distant political decisions made by people who have never experienced the life it contains. One warm evening, as daylight lingers well into what would be night during winter, your grandfather takes you on a walk along the coast. He's been quieter lately, spending more time alone, as if preparing himself for something. "Want to show you something," he says, leading you to a ridge overlooking the township. From this vantage point, you can see all the black houses scattered across the landscape, their low profiles blending into the natural contours of the land. Thin threads of smoke rise from each one, connecting earth to sky. Animals graze nearby. Small plots of cultivation create a patchwork of green among the rocky terrain. "This," your grandfather says, gesturing at the view, "is what they can't understand. They see primitive buildings. I see a way of living with the land, not just on it." You study the scene, trying to see it through his eyes and through the inspector's simultaneously. The contrast is stark. Where one sees backwardness, the other sees wisdom. Where one sees problems to solve, the other sees solutions evolved over centuries. "Take that home," your grandfather says, pointing to your family's black house. "From here, can you even tell where the house ends and the land begins?" You realize he's right. The black house seems to emerge organically from the landscape, its materials, local stone, turf, thatch, creating a structure that belongs to its environment in a way modern buildings never could. "That wasn't accident," your grandfather continues. "Our ancestors understood something most folks have forgotten. We're not separate from the land. What we build, how we live, it needs to work with what's already here, not against it." This was the profound wisdom embedded in black house design, I explain. It wasn't about conquering nature or imposing human will on the environment. It was about finding the point of balance where human needs could be met while working within natural systems rather than against them. As you walk back toward home, your grandfather places a hand on your shoulder, an unusual gesture for a man typically sparing with physical affection. "Changes are coming," he says simply. "Some we can't fight. But remember what you saw today. There's wisdom in these old ways, even if the world's forgetting it." That night, lying in your familiar straw bed beneath wool blankets woven by your mother and grandmother, you find yourself cataloguing sensory details of black house life. The particular smell of peat smoke mixed with wool lanolin and animal musk, the sound of wind, finding small gaps in the thatch, the way firelight plays on stone walls, the comfort of human and animal breathing creating a gentle soundtrack to sleep. Whether these regulations force immediate change or not, you understand now that your grandfather is right. This way of life cannot continue indefinitely. The world is indeed shrinking. External forces are too powerful, too persistent. The Black House era is coming to its natural conclusion. Many black houses remained inhabited well into the 20th century, I tell you. The last families only moved out in the 1970s, but as a mainstream dwelling type, their time was ending. Government regulations, changing economic patterns, and shifting cultural expectations all contributed to their decline. Years later, as an adult, you might return to this coast and find a different landscape. Most black houses standing empty, their thatch replaced with corrugated metal if maintained at all, their buyers silent of animals, some collapsed back into the land from which they rose, their stones reclaimed for other purposes or simply weathered back into the earth. A few might be preserved as museums or tourist attractions, carefully maintained examples of a vanished way of life. Visitors from around the world would walk through spaces once filled with the mundane business of survival, trying to imagine what life was really like within these stone walls. They would take photographs, read informational plaques, perhaps even feel a sense of connection to the past. But few would truly grasp what the Black House represented, not just an architectural style, but an entire integrated system of human adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments. And that's exactly what happened, I say softly. Today you can visit Black House museums on Lewis and other islands. They're fascinating glimpses into the past, but they're empty vessels now. The living culture that animated them, the integrated knowledge system they contained, the human-animal landscape relationship they facilitated, all that is largely gone. Yet something of the Black House wisdom survives, preserved in unexpected ways. Modern sustainable architecture rediscovers principles your ancestors took for granted, working with local materials, designing with climate in mind, creating structures that respond to their environment rather than imposing upon it. Green roofs on contemporary buildings echo the living thatch of black houses. Passive heating and cooling systems reflect the thermal mass principles of stone and earth walls. The growing interest in human-scale, community-oriented housing speaks to the social wisdom embedded in township layouts. The Black House may have vanished as a living tradition, but its core insights, hard-won through centuries of trial and error at the edge of survival, remain relevant in a world increasingly confronting environmental limits and climate uncertainty. The profound irony, I observe, is that just as the last black houses were being abandoned as primitive, modern society began facing challenges that these primitive structures had already solved: how to build sustainably, how to minimize resource use, how to create dwellings adapted to specific environmental conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the Black House offers a philosophical lesson increasingly urgent in our contemporary context. It demonstrates a different way of conceiving the human relationship with the natural world, not as conquest or control, but as conversation and adaptation. Its builders didn't try to create perfect environmental isolation or to overcome natural constraints. Instead, they worked within them, developing a dwelling that breathed with its environment, that aged and shifted and required ongoing attention, much like the human body itself. In a world now grappling with the consequences of treating nature as something to be conquered rather than collaborated with, this ancient wisdom takes on new significance. The Black House stands as testimony to a different possibility, a way of meeting human needs while remaining in dialogue with the natural systems that ultimately sustain all life. As you drift towards sleep in your comfortable modern bed with its climate control and synthetic materials, perhaps there's something to learn from those smoke-filled, earth-floored dwellings that sheltered generations on the edge of the Atlantic. Not a romantic return to harder times, but a reclaiming of certain wisdom about resilience, community, and living within limits. The Black House wasn't perfect. Life within its walls was undeniably difficult by modern standards, but it represented an accumulated wisdom about survival that deserves recognition and respect, a reminder that progress isn't always linear, that what looks primitive might contain sophisticated adaptations lost in supposedly advanced alternatives. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll walk through that stone doorway once more, feel the warmth of the central hearth, hear the soft sounds of animals in the byre, sense the presence of generations who survived against incredible odds in one of Earth's most challenging environments. And in that dream, maybe you'll understand what your grandfather meant when he spoke of the beauty within the hardship, the profound sense of place, purpose, and connection that came with truly knowing how to live in balance with a specific piece of earth. As the modern world faces its own set of existential challenges, there are worse guides to consult than the builders of black houses, those masters of adaptation who understood that true security comes not from imposing human will upon the environment, but from finding the sweet spot where human needs and natural systems can coexist in dynamic, responsive relationship. The black house is gone, but what it can teach us remains, if we're willing to listen to the wisdom embedded in stone and earth and the stubborn resilience of people who refused to disappear, even when history seemed determined to erase them from the map. Sleep well, dreaming perhaps of stone walls warmed by centuries of peat fires, of communities that held together against all odds, of knowledge passed hand to hand through generations.